I'm Jessica the Museum Guide, and I'm a former Jack the Ripper tour guide with a lot to say about Jack the Ripper tours and the Jack the Ripper Museum.
Today I'm doing something I put off for many years. I'm visiting the controversial Jack the Ripper Museum on Cable Street in East London. I may not be the world's expert on Jack the Ripper, but I am an expert on museums and on the commemoration of murder victims, which I'll explain a bit more later on. I'm also a former Jack the Ripper tour guide. That's why today you're going to see me do something that I don't normally do, and that is absolutely slate a museum.
When is the branding of a dapper Victorian gentleman going after the poor, unfortunate women of the East End turn into something that is a sick morality tale? We're going to explore that and more today on this tour as I visit the Jack the Ripper Museum on Cable Street and take you to some of the sites associated with the Ripper's crimes, and more importantly, with his victims' lives.
But first, let me say welcome back to my channel, and I'm so glad you're here. My regular viewers know that I normally visit lovely, and sometimes controversial, museums and other strange places, and I get giddily excited about sharing paintings, oddities, graves, and artifacts. While today is a little different, I hope you'll join me on this tour, and like, comment, and subscribe. I also want to mention that I recently launched my Patreon. My patrons get ad-free versions of my videos, extra bonus videos, and even in-person tours. Your support means that I can continue to grow my channel and start to visit more museums around the world. Over on Patreon, I just published a video exploring the many bizarre and macabre objects inside St. Catherine Cree Church in the City of London, so head over and have a look. Now, let me preface this video by saying that the woman working at the Jack the Ripper Museum was absolutely lovely. I also want to acknowledge that I am deeply indebted to Hayley Rubenhold and her wonderful book, The Five. While I had been tossing these ideas around a lot in the years leading up to its publication, her sensitive, nuanced, and meticulous research about the lives of the Ripper's victims gave me so much to think about. I highly recommend reading her book. Now let me be clear, as a former Jack the Ripper tour guide, I used to profit from the same lurid details of the murders of the 5, 6, 8, or even 11 women that are referred to as the Whitechapel murder victims. I always tried to make my tours more sensitive to the victims and provide the subtleties missing from other tours, but the fact of the matter is that punters turned up to hear a sensationalized Victorian Gothic tale, and I was there to tell it, and make as much money as possible doing so. And that seems to be the MO of this museum as well. Jack the Ripper shot to infamy in 1888, at a time when speaking in public about sex and violence was quite taboo. But the murders of these women, some of whom sold sex for survival and others who were simply poor and addicted, gave people an opportunity to speak about sex at the breakfast table. The murders caused international shockwaves at a time when journalists were desperate for a story that would sell papers. And here, at this museum, it is being used to sell tickets at £12 per head. As we make our way into the museum, let me just start by saying the names of the 5 women often referred to as the canonical 5. Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, Catherine Kate Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. The museum has also included 3 additional women who are often associated with the murders: Martha Tabram, Emma Smith, and Alice Mackenzie, but their causes of death are different enough that they are usually believed to have been killed by a different person. Which begs the question why the museum chose to include them. Did the curators feel that 5 wasn't shocking enough? I know that when I used to do my preamble on walking tours, some people would almost seem disappointed that there weren't more victims. Between the 31st of August and 9th November 1888, at least 5 women were murdered in Whitechapel and Spitalfields, 4 of them on the streets and 1 in her bed. Some were almost certainly hunkered down to sleep rough. There's no evidence that Polly, Annie, and Kate ever worked in prostitution. In fact, there's evidence to the contrary, but the police and the newspapers could not conceive of a woman in the East End's desperate poverty who didn't sell sex. This reputation has followed these women for more than 136 years, and it's often used to discount and discredit them, and to create the mythos of a dapper gentleman who slummed it in the East End and rid the area of its most diabolical scourge, the so-called unfortunates who tramped its streets in search of a drink, a bed, or a kind word. On our tour today, I won't be delving too much into the specificities of each woman's life beyond the basics. If you would like a more detailed tour about the reality of life in the East End and each woman's personal backstory, let me know in the comment section below. Now here we are on the landing of the museum. There it is, the classic symbol of Jack the Ripper, the top hat, which would have cost quite a pretty penny. Whoever this sick murderer was, he almost certainly did not wear an expensive top hat and a dashing cloak, which would have made him stick out in the impoverished East End. But that inaccuracy is the least of our worries today. This museum was first proposed to the community in 2014 as a historical institution meant to chronicle and pay homage to the East End's impressive labor history, with a focus on the women who protested and rallied to create many of the working rights that we enjoy today. The museum's located on Cable Street, itself known for the historic Battle of Cable Street in 1936, when thousands turned out to counter a pro-fascist march in the area. It's a street steeped in protest history, which is something that the museum's founder, Mark Palmer Edgecombe, found out. Now, he's a former head of diversity at Google, but he claims that as the project developed, he decided a more interesting angle was from the perspective of the victims of the Ripper, which is not what this museum is, as you'll see. However, The Guardian did a tiny amount of digging, only to discover that the museum's own website stated that Palmer Edgecombe wanted to explore the story of Jack the Ripper as far back as 2008, 6 years before he claims that the museum's mandate changed. He knew what he was doing the whole time. As you can imagine, this change of priorities stirred up a lot of protest, as you can see from these pictures. Now, I remember these protests, and that's honestly why I've never been here before today. And it wasn't just the community that was outraged. The architects who designed this space, and did it at a rock-bottom price to help support the cause, also felt deceived. The architect wrote that it was salacious, misogynist rubbish. Now, I'm heading up the stairs and visiting the first room in the museum, which has been mocked up to look like one of the crime scenes. It's the site of Kate Eddowes' murder at Mitre Square, on the edge of the financial district.
We're walking through the real Mitre Square right now. Obviously, it's a lot different than it was in the summer of 1888. Different architectural tastes have changed, and of course the Blitz bombs really changed the landscape of this entire area. If we were here at night, this whole square would be thronged with different Jack the Ripper tours. On one night, I counted 34 passing through this area.
It's my opinion that Jack the Ripper was a sad little man, likely poor, who lived in the East End and liked to kill sleeping women who were down on their luck and didn't have anywhere else to go. And yes, I did say sleeping women, not women engaged in sex work, because despite everything you've ever been told about Jack the Ripper, and despite some of the trash that I used to parrot every time I did this tour, most of the Ripper's victims were not sex workers, although they would be no less deserving of our sympathy, even if they were. But instead, they were desperately poor, and in some cases terminally ill, women addicted to alcohol and forced to sleep on the streets. They did odd jobs, begged for money, and regularly checked in and out of London's workhouses when they had no money to pay for a bed and were sick of sleeping on these streets. While they were trying to get some rest, a creepy little weirdo crept up on them and slashed their throats and eviscerated them. He was probably too timid to even speak to them while they were conscious. Now, this take makes some people very mad. After all, an entire industry has been built up on the idea that Jack the Ripper was some sort of suave, debonair gentleman who meted out justice to bad women, or who had an animalistic sense of Mr. Hyde lust that just couldn't be controlled. Ripper conventions, Ripperologists, Ripper souvenirs, Jack the Clipper, Jack the Chipper, Vision tours, complete with lurid projections onto the walls where the women died. I've seen guides dressed up in costumes, carrying lanterns, and even chasing their guests with big rubber knives. One guide even plays the psycho sound when he reaches the murder sites. And then there are photos like this one.
Please tell me that's an art project. That can't actually be a Jack the Ripper themed baked potato shop, can it? Am I going mad?
So you tell me that this is just about trying to solve a cold case. No, it's not. It's about so much more than that. Over the course of the last 136 years, Jack the Ripper has become a cultural icon and very much a Victorian anti-hero, taking his place alongside Sweeney Todd, Mr. Hyde, and Sherlock Holmes. But of course, those are fictional characters, whereas Jack the Ripper was a real person who killed real women. But back to this room in the museum. Over on the wall, we have some legendary graffiti. It's doubtful that it's even connected to the case, but it's been used as evidence of a Freemason plot due to the spelling of the word Jews. This spelling is similar to 3 characters in an American Masonic ritual. This graffiti, wiped away by Detective Frederick Aberline and Chief of Police Charles Warren before it could even be properly documented, has spawned countless conspiracy theories and anti-Semitic hate. Now, we'll come back to that topic when we have a look at some newspapers, but for now, we're heading upstairs to the Ripper's apartment. We're now in the museum's mock-up of the Ripper's posh flat. What a swanky place, and a place of almost certain fiction. There's a sort of attempt to make the visitor look for clues here, but overall, it's just another diorama. Here we have a painting depicting crime writer Patricia Cornwell's favorite subject, painter Walter Sickert. Now, I don't want to delve too much into individual suspects on this tour today, but Sickert is really just a silly theory. Cornwell started with her preferred suspect and painted herself, pun intended, into a corner, even when the evidence didn't match her hypothesis. Sickert is just, it's ridiculous. I don't know. Maybe it's because I've been Googling Jack the Ripper lately that TikTok has decided I'm the prime audience for a lot of true crime videos on this topic. So I've seen videos lately discussing whether Edgar Degas was Jack the Ripper, or of course the ever popular and utterly asinine theory that Jack the Ripper was old-timey American psycho H.H. Holmes. I've also heard that he was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Lewis Carroll, Joseph Merrick, aka the Elephant Man, and the Royal Conspiracy featuring the Duke of Clarence. The list of sexy, brooding, and complicated subjects is endless, and it's also infuriating. Now here's an apt reference, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Of course, a work of fiction, not unlike so much Jack the Ripper lore. Do I sound more than a bit peeved? It's the timing. During my master's degree, I studied the complexities around trying to design a memorial for Vancouver's so-called missing women, the at least 49 sex workers, many of them First Nations, murdered by pig farmer Robert Pickton. That disgusting monster died a few weeks ago, and I guess that's why I chose right now to do this museum. Because no one looks at Pickton, who I won't even picture here, and thinks, wow, what a sexy story. I want a Pickton coffee mug or a Pickton fridge magnet. However, they do just that for Jack the Ripper, and the two aren't really all that different. They're creepy little men killing the most vulnerable women in society because they could get away with it. That's a harsh indictment of both them and us. There have been dozens of serial killers who have targeted sex workers, and in many cases, those women are also Indigenous or women of color. We know that Picton was a slimy, pathetic nobody, but I would bet that Jack the Ripper was exactly the same. At the end of my Jack the Ripper tours, people would always ask me, "So, Jessica, who do you think did it?" And the real answer was, if I was being honest, I don't care. Because the sad fact is that whoever it was, and I do personally think it was a mentally ill man called Aaron Kosminski, I just don't even think he's worth thinking about. Director Bruce Robinson, who wrote a book called They All Love Jack, would disagree with me, by the way. He couldn't see how the puny little Kosminski, with his delusions and poor personal hygiene, could have overpowered 5 women. His preferred suspect, complete with a grand Masonic plot that would be more fitting in one of his films, is composer Michael Maybrick. Robinson didn't, however, consider the fact that the women could have been sleeping when killed or just simply too intoxicated to fight back. And if I'm wrong, oh well! The time has passed to bring the murderer to justice, and I don't want to spend any more time thinking about this waste of space than I already have. So let's face it, the Ripper's real dwelling probably looked either like a bed in a poor East End doss house or the corner of a working-class family home, which was likely just a few rooms in and of itself. It was not a high society apartment with a posh sitting area. Again, here's the ubiquitous top hat and cloak, absolutely silly if you know the history of the area at all. Here's another suspect, the eccentric American Francis Tumblety, who sold snake oil and porno books and had a collection of preserved uteruses in glass jars. But he was also a known homosexual. Gay serial killers don't kill women. Ugh, this whole thing just looks like a Halloween display. This is supposedly a lock of Mary Jane Kelly's hair, but it's dubious at best. And here's a mock-up from the From Hell letter, from which Alan Moore got the name for his graphic novel about Jack the Ripper, which is paired with a fake kidney to represent the real kidney supposedly sent to George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. That kidney, if it was even human, could have come from a morgue or could have been from an animal. Remember, this is 1888 and there's no way to tell. Here we have a little display of Freemason memorabilia. I actually have 2 videos that visit Freemasonry museums, one in London and one in Paris, and I've linked them just above. The Freemasonry evidence is so tenuous that it's hardly worth mentioning, but people love a good secret society and a good conspiracy theory, don't they? This room buys into the silliest and most egregious myths about Jack the Ripper, that he was a high society gentleman or even a doctor or a surgeon. While initial postmortem reports noted that the killer may have had surgical knowledge to remove a uterus or kidney, some later said that this prowess was overstated and that the organs had been removed in a crude way. Of course, medical training would not have been the only place to gain anatomical knowledge. Butchers, barber surgeons, and even farmers would have had a working understanding of mammal anatomy. So too would someone who had tortured animals. I'm heading back out onto the stairwell, plastered with the broadsheet newspapers of the day. The press were the architects of how we view Jack the Ripper, crafting his image carefully to appeal to the masses and to sell papers. Armed with a horrifying nickname, Jack the Ripper, gleaned from the Dear Boss letter that we will see shortly, journalists quickly fashioned a terrifying figure to cast blame on. There was no clear suspect or target for all of this pandemonium and panic, so the press chose to label the anonymous killer with haunting, and undoubtedly catchy, titles such as Monster and Fiend, which added an almost supernatural element to the killer's reputation. You can see that in these images here. As a tour guide, I cannot tell you how many guests I have had who believed that Jack the Ripper was a fictional character. After all, he slots quite neatly into the trope of the Victorian Gothic villain. Of course, we also have to address the rampant anti-Semitism that is clear in these papers and in society in general in 1888 London. The East End was known as London's Jewish quarter when 200,000 Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews who were forced to flee pogroms in Russia and Poland settled there, some for a generation and some for much, much longer, becoming a part of modern London life. Of course, that doesn't mean that Jack the Ripper wasn't Jewish, but it does mean that we have to critique what we read extra carefully when caricatures like these ones were acceptable in the daily papers. Now we're in a mock-up of the office of a police detective, potentially Detective Frederick Aberline, furiously on the case and sifting through clues. On the wall here, we have a list of the victims. Again, the museum has gone with 8 instead of the canonical 5, and some of the most famous suspects. This is really the only room that has any artifacts on display that are even tenuously connected to Jack the Ripper. In this case here, we can see some of the museum's latest acquisitions. 4 objects that were on the person of Constable Edward Watkins at the time that he discovered the body of Catherine Eddowes. His truncheon, whistle, handcuffs, and notebook. On the wall are even more copies of the Illustrated Police News, one of the newspapers dedicated to sharing shocking and titillating details of the crimes, which were a popular source of cheap entertainment for an increasingly literate working class. Stories were exaggerated and moral panics were stoked to a fever pitch, with half-truths and outright lies printed and sold like hotcakes. The museum really struggles to fill these rooms with connections to Jack the Ripper. Here's another reference to Jekyll and Hyde. Apparently, American stage actor Richard Mansfield had been discussed as a potential suspect because he was just too convincing as the madman on stage in the West End that summer. This stringboard really reminds me of that Always Sunny in Philadelphia meme. You can't unsee it now. We can also see some replicas of the most famous Jack the Ripper letters, over 200 of which were mailed to journalists, police officers, and local residents. The name Jack the Ripper comes from one of these letters, though modern criminologists believe that they were likely all fakes, sent by pranksters and journalists themselves. Now, times have changed very little. People remain the same. There's still a love of true crime, especially popular in the last few decades with the advent of podcasts and YouTube. There's been a lot of coverage in the media lately, and a lot of hand-wringing, about women and true crime, and a push to chastise the women who enjoy relaxing with a glass of wine while they learn about gruesome murders. Instead of feeling like the victim, we place ourselves into the shoes of the detective, and that is empowering. That's where things get muddy, because for a lot of women, confronting their fears of violence in a safe environment helps them to feel more empowered and paradoxically more safe. I think Freud would argue that by externalizing our fears of being murdered, we're able to consume it as entertainment, kind of like how roller coasters allow us to experience terror in a safely controlled environment. And that's exactly what this is. So again, why does this museum feel so exploitative? Maybe that's why I'm struggling. This is less a museum and more a diorama. It's kind of like the London Dungeon. It's also riddled with inaccuracies, and the controversy over its origins is also still lingering in my mind. I'm all for good fun, and there's a conflict in my own content, because I describe the people tortured and executed by kings and queens with great gusto. Is all dark tourism ghoulish? Where do I personally draw the line? I mean, if I had to explain this schism, I think it has to do with the fact that this is still happening. Poor, marginalized women, including trans women, are still a target for violence. And it is their perceived association with sex work, that whether that is invented or reality, that makes them less worthy of investigation and justice. I mean, again, just think of the victims of Robert Pickton, or the Grim Sleeper in LA, or the Yorkshire Ripper Peter Sutcliffe here in England, or the Highway of Tears in British Columbia. I could list many, many more. This museum, and Jack the Ripper tours in general, try to present this violence as a quaint Victorian peccadillo, a spooky remnant of a bygone era, when in fact it is a constant. It hasn't changed. And women are in as much danger today as we were on the streets of Whitechapel in the summer and autumn of 1888. A really interesting route the museum could have taken here in this gallery about the police is to highlight the problem of having two police forces. The fact that the crimes occurred on the border between the square mile of the City of London and what was then the borough of Stepney, and therefore under the jurisdiction of the London Metropolitan Police. And therefore having two different police forces who did not get along investigating the crimes could have really ruined the investigation. But there's no mention of this complexity. Just a silly set to walk through. Now this room is at the top of the building and attempts to show us what the women's rooms where they slept might have looked like. Now I can appreciate what they're trying to do here, but this is so inaccurate. The only one of the canonical five who stayed in a private room like this one was Mary Kelly, and even hers was described as dark, grim, and filthy, and she usually shared it with her on-again, off-again boyfriend. I mean, the curios are a lovely touch, but come on. These are women who pawned their clothing. There's even a pawn ticket on the wall referencing the fact that Kate Eddowes pawned her boyfriend's shoes a few days before her death. They certainly would have pawned nice little decor bits like this first. This painting here is actually a better example of where they would have slept, in so-called coffin beds for 4 pence a night. We know that Annie Chapman, suffering from TB, paid 8 pence a night for a double bed, but that was in a dorm surrounded by other people. This modest bed would have been a luxury that the women had not known since they left their marriages and their family homes. And speaking of poor Annie, her biography, as always, tars her with the Victorian taint of prostitution, when she likely did not ever engage in the trade. She was 47, a chronic alcoholic, and suffering with tuberculosis, which she was receiving treatment for. Of course, that doesn't mean she didn't sell sex, but no one that she knew said that she did. The song playing is a rendition of A Violet Plucked from Mother's Grave, which witnesses heard Mary Jane Kelly singing on the evening of her death, perhaps while entertaining a suitor or paying client, because we know that Mary Jane Kelly was indeed a sex worker. We can see some quotes on the wall, some of which are the last words the women were heard to say, like the quote here about the bonnet. This is what Polly Nichols was supposedly heard to say as she went up to try to scrounge her DOS money in the middle of the night. However, some of these quotes were collected by journalists talking to random East End unfortunates during the Rippers' reign of terror. Again, I question including 8 victims here without presenting any caveat or stating that 3 of these 8 are not commonly considered part of the canonical 5. As I make my way back downstairs to the basement, which is the order that the museum suggests you should visit, we can see a little display talking about change in the East End. Spitalfields and Shoreditch really started to gentrify in the 1980s and 90s. First came the artists, then the hipsters, and now the bankers, as the financial district creeps further and further east down Whitechapel High Street. The women wouldn't recognize it. I mean, I barely recognize it, and I've lived here for less than 15 years. Now let's enter into the museum's final room. You can see it says here, warning, this is a mortuary. I mean, no, it's not. When I first learned about the museum, I remember reading that it was located in the former mortuary, where some of the victims underwent their post-mortem examination. Now, if you've watched my video about my hometown in Vancouver, you know that I used to work in a crime museum housed in an old morgue, and so this actually made sense to me. However, I must have misunderstood. The mortuary where Elizabeth Stride underwent her post-mortem is actually nearby, located in St. George's in the East in Shadwell. As the museum attempts to maintain a tenuous grasp to proximity and center itself as a valid historical site, there is a fake blue plaque on the exterior that reads "The Body of Elizabeth Stride" in large letters, with the actual location in smaller letters underneath. Upon realizing that this was simply a Victorian townhouse and not the old morgue, I was really not prepared for the basement level. It has been Disneyfied into a mock-up of a morgue, and a historically inaccurate one at that, and nothing made me feel worse in this museum than the fake morgue. Remember, I'm comfortable in a morgue. I worked in one for years, but there is something so exploitative about building a fake morgue to, quote, commemorate real women.
Now, just take a step back. Imagine if it was your photo being shown on the walls of a morgue, or even worse, being projected onto the side of the place where you were murdered. Now take it one step further and imagine that it was your mangled and bloody autopsy photo, which is common. Those photos are passed around and shown on every walking tour. I mean, if you've watched my videos before, you know I don't believe in ghosts, but maybe I do believe in bad energy, and this whole building had a terrible feeling to it.
And there is no doubt that only one thing is being honored in this room, and that is male violence against women. No schmaltzy candle can disguise that fact. I'm now leaving the museum, and honestly, I feel like I need to shower off the energy of that place. Now here are my final thoughts. For many years, I was a part of the Jack the Ripper industrial complex. I told myself I was giving a better tour, but I was actually just regurgitating a lot of the same nonsense that's repeated in this museum. And every now and then, I would get a rude awakening.
I vividly remember a night on what remained of Flower and Dean Street, which was a location of some of the most notorious lodging houses or doss houses in London. And I was regaling the crowd with a story about Polly Nichols' final night on the street. And I'm sure it was riddled with inaccuracies that I had learned. And a survival level sex worker came up to the group and began really shouting at us, screaming about how she had friends who'd been murdered down by the Thames, and she knew sex workers that were abused in ways exactly like Jack the Ripper's victims, and she wanted to know why we were on that tour and why we didn't care about her. Yeah. Some people in my group started to get defensive, and I stopped them. I said, no, she's right. And I let her finish. And after the tour was over that night, I left from here, Mitre Square, and went all the way back into Whitechapel to go looking for her. My husband was on the phone saying, what are you doing? That could be dangerous. But I guess I just needed her to absolve my guilt. I wanted to tell her that no, my tour was different, and I focused on respecting the women. But at its core, did my tour really do that? No. And it certainly didn't make her life any better. And clearly it upset her. She wasn't asking for money. She just wanted to vent her disgust at us. And I think we deserved it. I didn't find her that night, and I still think about her to this day. She's one of the reasons I'm making this video.
I think my sentiments can be summed up by Laura Watson, who's a spokeswoman for the English Collective of Prostitutes. She says, "We object to Jack the Ripper tours because they represent the gruesome murder of 5 women as an exciting, tantalizing event, glorifying the man while invisibilizing the women. What a distortion and abuse of our humanity that 5 women who were tortured to death are of less interest than the monster that killed them." As I mentioned before, this video was in no way meant to explore the lives of the victims, but their lives were worthwhile and valid. If you were interested in a separate video where I visit their home neighborhoods and pay my respects to their final resting places, let me know. I can guarantee that it will not be a typical Jack the Ripper tour.
Well, that's the end of our tour here in Spitalfields. I hope you enjoyed learning all about this complex and complicated topic, and I'm sure many of you are going to have something to say in the comment section below. I look forward to hearing your thoughts, and I'll see you the next time I'm at the museum.